Picture yourself holding an invitation. Heavy cardstock, elegant script, and only one line. 350 Fifth Avenue. This isn't just a party invitation. This is a verdict on your entire existence in Gilded Age society. If it arrives, you matter. Your business deal's close. Your daughters marry well. If it doesn't, you're nobody. Your fortune means nothing. Your mansion is just expensive real estate. One woman controlled who received that invitation for 50 years. Caroline Astor, known simply as the Mrs. Astor, didn't just host parties. She invented American aristocracy. In a nation built on rejecting inherited titles, she created something more powerful, a social hierarchy so rigid that European nobility looked on with envy. Her weapon? Architecture. While others spent fortunes on jewels, Caroline understood something profound. Control the physical spaces where society gathers, and you control society itself. Her ballrooms were sorting machines. Her mansions were fortresses designed to project power and intimidate rivals. The famous 400, the number who could fit in her ballroom, became shorthand for American exclusivity that persists 140 years later. That number wasn't arbitrary. It was architectural. It was calculated genius. But how did she do it? How did one woman, starting from a modest brownstone, build an empire that made industrial titans beg for invitations? How did she turn real estate into absolute social control? This is how Mrs. Astor's mansions gave her total control over the Gilded Age. Not through titles, not through office, through strategic real estate and theatrical genius that transformed American society forever. Before we begin, if you enjoy these deep dives into Gilded Age power and architecture, please hit the like button and subscribe. Your support helps me continue researching and creating these videos. Also, please comment if you have any thoughts on the topic or if you have visited these mansions before. Now let's go inside. The brownstone that started an empire. In 1862, Caroline Schermerhorn married William Backhouse Astor Jr., connecting two of New York's oldest fortunes. The Schermerhorns were Dutch aristocracy, old Knickerbocker money that had been in Manhattan since it was New Amsterdam. The Astors were relatively new money, built on fur trading and ruthless real estate speculation by William's grandfather, Commodore John Jacob Astor. Old money, marrying new money. It should have been a perfect alliance, except nobody particularly cared. New York society in 1862 was chaotic. The Civil War was raging. Fortunes were being made and lost in months. The social structure that had governed New York for generations was collapsing as new industrial wealth flooded the city. Who belonged at the top? Nobody could agree. William's father, sensing an opportunity to elevate his family's standing, made a strategic decision. As a wedding gift, he gave the young couple prime Manhattan real estate, a plot on Fifth Avenue at 34th Street. The location was perfect, central, prestigious, but not yet fully developed. This was before Fifth Avenue became the address. William Sr. understood that his gift wasn't just land, it was position. The couple built their mansion in 1862. From the outside, it was deliberately understated. 4 stories, brownstone, respectable width at 50 feet by 107 feet deep. The only distinguishing features were Nova Scotia freestone accents around the windows and a double stoop entrance flanked by Corinthian columns. Classical. Dignified. Nothing that screamed new money desperation. This was Caroline's first lesson in architectural strategy. Restraint signals, confidence. Her Schermerhorn upbringing had taught her that true aristocracy never needs to shout. The Astors had fought for decades against whispers that they were vulgar, that grandfather's fur-trading fortune smelled of dead animals and sharp dealing. Caroline's brownstone whispered instead, "We've always belonged here." Inside, the house revealed more ambition. 3 connected drawing rooms on the parlor floor created a continuous entertaining space. Not massive by later standards, but clever. Guests could flow between rooms, creating the impression of greater space and grandeur than the footprint suggested. The formal dining room featured English Regency styling, another nod to European sophistication that new money Astors desperately craved. But the heart of the house was the ballroom. Not large, maybe 40 by 50 feet. Capacity, approximately 400 people if you packed them in efficiently. That number would become legendary, but in 1862, it was simply practical. 400 represented Manhattan's entire social elite. Every family that mattered could fit in Caroline's ballroom. The early years at 350 Fifth Avenue were quiet. Caroline was young, still learning her role. She hosted dinners, small receptions, the expected entertainments of a wealthy young matron. Nothing revolutionary, nothing that suggested the empire she would build. Then 1869 arrived, and everything changed. Directly across Fifth Avenue, retail magnate Alexander Turney Stewart began construction on the largest private mansion New York had ever seen. Not a brownstone, not restrained. A pure white marble palazzo that looked like it had been airlifted from Renaissance Italy and dropped onto Fifth Avenue without apology. Stewart's mansion was obscene by old money standards, massive, elaborate, screaming new money with every marble column and gilded detail. It cost over $2 million, an unthinkable sum. When it was completed in 1869, it dominated the neighborhood like a commercial statement. I'm richer than you, and I want everyone to know it. Caroline, looking out her windows at Stewart's palazzo, understood something crucial. The game had changed. Restraint was no longer enough. If she wanted to maintain social supremacy, she needed to match and surpass the new money families that were building palaces across Manhattan. But she was patient. She watched. She learned. She hosted her annual January ball, carefully curating the guest list, slowly establishing herself as the arbiter of who belonged. The ballroom's capacity helped. 400 people meant 400 families, exclusive enough to matter, large enough to include everyone who needed to be included. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, 350 Fifth Avenue became the center of New York social life. Not because it was the grandest house, it wasn't. Not because Caroline threw the most lavish parties, others spent more, but because an invitation to Mrs. Astor's annual ball meant you existed in society, and the lack of an invitation meant you didn't. Ward McAllister, Caroline's social secretary and enforcer, helped codify the system. He called them the 400, the exact number who could fit in Mrs. Astor's ballroom. The number stuck. Newspapers began referring to society as the 400. Families desperate for inclusion would ask McAllister what they needed to do, what they needed to change, how they could earn that invitation. McAllister would smile and explain, Mrs. Astor decides. And Mrs. Astor's decisions are final. The brownstone gave Caroline something more valuable than grandeur. It gave her scarcity. The ballroom's limited capacity meant exclusivity wasn't a choice. It was architectural necessity. She couldn't invite everyone, even if she wanted to. The house made exclusion inevitable, which made inclusion priceless. But by the early 1890s, the neighborhood was changing again. And this time, the threat came from within her own family. The neighbor war that changed everything. William Waldorf Astor was Caroline's nephew by marriage, her husband's nephew technically. He was also rich, ambitious, and deeply resentful that his aunt, not him, controlled the Astor family's social position. In 1890, William Waldorf made a decision that would change Manhattan real estate forever. He owned the property directly next to 350 Fifth Avenue, the plot where his father, John Jacob Astor III, had lived. When John died in 1890, William Waldorf inherited the house, and he immediately announced plans to demolish it, to build a hotel, not just any hotel, the Waldorf Hotel, a massive, luxurious establishment that would cater to wealthy travelers and host elaborate public functions. It would be grand, it would be profitable, and it would be right next door to Caroline Astor's brownstone. The message was clear. If you won't acknowledge my social position, Aunt Caroline, I'll build something that makes your precious exclusivity irrelevant. I'll open society to anyone who can afford a hotel room. Caroline was furious. A hotel next door would mean constant construction noise, traffic, commercial activity destroying the residential character of her address. Worse, it meant her nephew was essentially declaring war, trying to force her to acknowledge him as an equal by making her life miserable. William Waldorf played the situation perfectly. He was polite, regretful even, but business was business. The hotel would be built. Construction began in 1892. The noise was relentless. Hammering, drilling, shouting workmen, delivery wagons arriving at all hours. The construction shook Caroline's house. Plaster cracked. Windows rattled. Hosting elegant dinner parties became impossible when your guests had to shout over construction noise. For 2 years, Caroline endured it. She was 70 years old, had ruled New York society for decades, and now her own nephew was driving her from her home through sheer commercial spite. But Caroline Astor didn't surrender. She planned revenge. If William Waldorf wanted a hotel war, he'd get one. But Caroline would make sure she won. Not by building her own hotel. That would be beneath her. No, she'd build something that would make William Waldorf's Waldorf Hotel look like a commercial afterthought. She'd build a palace. In 1893, Caroline made her move. She purchased property further up Fifth Avenue, at 65th Street, where the avenue faced Central Park. The location was perfect, further from the commercial creep consuming Lower Fifth Avenue. Facing the park meant permanent views, permanent prestige, and far enough from William Waldorf's hotel that she'd never have to acknowledge its existence. Then she made the most important decision of her architectural career. She hired Richard Morris Hunt. Hunt was America's preeminent architect. He'd designed Biltmore for the Vanderbilts. He'd created the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. If you were Gilded Age wealthy and wanted a mansion that would announce your status for centuries, you hired Richard Morris Hunt. Caroline gave Hunt clear instructions: build me something that will make every other mansion in New York look provincial. Price is not a concern. Time is not a concern. Build me a palace worthy of America's social queen. Hunt smiled. He understood exactly what she wanted, not just a house, a statement, a fortress, a throne room from which Caroline could continue ruling society, but on a scale that would intimidate anyone who dared challenge her authority. Meanwhile, William Waldorf's Waldorf Hotel opened in 1893 to great fanfare. It was magnificent, everything he'd promised. Elegant rooms, elaborate dining spaces, a social center for New York's elite. William Waldorf waited for Caroline to apologize, to admit defeat, to acknowledge that he'd won. She didn't acknowledge anything. She was too busy planning her new palace. William Waldorf's victory turned hollow quickly. Yes, his hotel was successful, but Caroline's departure had turned 34th Street into merely a commercial district. The address lost its social cachet the moment she left. The Waldorf was profitable, but it wasn't prestigious, not the way Caroline's residence had been. And then Caroline's son, John Jacob Astor IV, William Waldorf's cousin, made an unexpected move. In 1897, he built his own hotel directly next to the Waldorf, the Astoria Hotel, even grander than William Waldorf's establishment. The two buildings eventually merged, becoming the Waldorf Astoria, one of New York's legendary hotels. But by then, Caroline didn't care. She'd already moved, and her new address, 840 Fifth Avenue, would make everyone forget that 34th Street had ever mattered. The war was over. William Waldorf had won a battle by building a hotel. Caroline won the war by building an empire. Hiring Richard Morris Hunt, the architect of power. Richard Morris Hunt was 56 years old in 1893 when Caroline Astor walked into his office with an impossible request: design me a palace that will make every other mansion in New York obsolete. Hunt had heard ambitious requests before. He was America's first architect to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the man who designed the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty, the architect behind the breakers in Newport and Biltmore in North Carolina. Every Gilded Age titan wanted Hunt because he understood something fundamental. These people weren't building homes. They were building statements. But Caroline's request was different. She wasn't trying to prove she belonged. She already ruled society. She wasn't competing with other wealthy families. She'd already beaten them. What Caroline needed was architectural intimidation on a scale that would prevent future challenges entirely. Hunt understood immediately. This wasn't about beauty or comfort or even grandeur. This was about power made physical. He proposed a radical idea: spend 3 months in Europe studying the great chateaux of France. Not to copy them, Americans had been doing that badly for decades, but to understand the psychology behind them. How did French aristocracy use architecture to project permanence? What made visitors feel small before they even met the nobles inside? Caroline agreed without hesitation. Money was no object. Time was no object. Get it right. Hunt departed for France in late 1893, sketchbook in hand. He studied the chateaux of the Loire Valley, Chambord, Chenonceau, Blois. These weren't just large houses. They were designed to overwhelm, to announce that the families living inside had been powerful for centuries, and would remain powerful for centuries more. He paid particular attention to proportion. A chateau's power came not from size alone, but from the relationship between scale and detail. Massive walls covered in intricate stone carving, soaring rooflines that drew the eye upward, making visitors crane their necks. Grand staircases that forced guests to ascend dramatically, arriving at the main floor already feeling diminished by the journey. Hunt filled notebooks with measurements, sketches, observations about sight lines and material choices. He studied how light fell through tall windows, how marble reflected and amplified grandeur, how the progression through rooms could be choreographed to build anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. When he returned to New York in early 1894, Hunt brought Caroline something more valuable than drawings. He brought psychological architecture. The design he presented wasn't a copy of any single French chateau. It was a synthesis, the best elements of French Renaissance architecture adapted for American ambitions and Manhattan's rectangular lots. The style would be early 16th century French Renaissance, reminiscent of the Chateau de Blois, but larger, more elaborate, more intimidating. Hunt explained his vision. The mansion would read as 2 separate residences joined by a magnificent glass-domed entrance hall. From the street, it would appear as one unified palace. Inside, careful planning would separate Caroline's domain from her son John Jacob Astor IV's residence, while shared spaces, particularly the ballroom, would demonstrate family unity and dynastic ambition. The entrance sequence was crucial. Visitors would pass through bronze gates, cross a forecourt, enter through massive doors into a vestibule lined with marble busts of Astor ancestors. Hunt understood the psychological power of making guests walk past previous generations before meeting the current matriarch. It announced, "This family has history, permanence, continuity. You are temporary. We are eternal." From the vestibule, guests would enter the Great Hall, 3 stories of marble magnificence with a cantilevered staircase rising dramatically upward. Hunt designed this space to make visitors feel physically small. The ceiling soared 50 feet above. The stairs were wide enough for 10 people to ascend side by side, but most guests would climb alone, acutely aware of their insignificance in this vast stone theater. Every material choice reinforced the message. Indiana limestone for the exterior, it would last centuries, weathering to a dignified patina that suggested age even when new. French-con stone for interior walls, the same material used in medieval cathedrals. Black marble for the dining room because nothing says permanence like stone so heavy it requires reinforced floors. Hunt also understood modern comfort hidden behind historical aesthetics. The mansion would have central heating, massive coal-fired boilers in the basement sending steam through miles of pipes. Electric lighting throughout, powered by the building's own generator. Elevators for staff and family. Modern plumbing with hot and cold running water in every bathroom. This juxtaposition was intentional. The house would look like a 16th century French chateau, but function with 1890s American technology. Guests would experience the intimidation of old-world aristocracy without any of the discomfort. It was theatrical illusion backed by modern engineering. Hunt's fee was substantial, tens of thousands of dollars just for the design work. But Caroline understood she wasn't paying for architectural drawings. She was paying for Hunt's understanding of power, his ability to translate social dominance into physical form. Construction began in 1894 on two adjacent lots at 5th Avenue and 65th Street. The site measured 100 feet by 100 feet, substantial but not enormous by Gilded Age standards. Hunt's genius was making the space feel vast through proportion and detail rather than raw square footage. He hired the finest craftsmen available, stonemasons from Italy who'd learned their trade working on cathedrals, French artisans who specialized in the intricate plasterwork that would cover ceilings throughout the mansion. The same workshops that had created interiors for European nobility now worked for Mrs. Astor. Hunt visited the construction site daily, checking every detail personally. When limestone blocks arrived from Indiana quarries, he inspected each one for color consistency. When Italian craftsmen installed marble floors, he verified the patterns matched his drawings exactly. This level of obsessive attention cost money and time, but Hunt knew Caroline would accept nothing less than perfection. Jules Allard, the legendary interior designer, worked alongside Hunt creating the French-style interiors. Allard had decorated countless European palaces and understood the language of aristocratic taste. Wood paneling hand-carved in France and shipped to New York. Silk wall coverings woven to Hunt's specifications. Furniture that looked antique but was actually new, built to accommodate modern bodies while suggesting centuries of family ownership. The project took 2 years. By 1896, the mansion was complete. Hunt had created exactly what Caroline requested, a palace that made every other New York residence look provincial by comparison. But Hunt's greatest achievement wasn't the building itself. It was understanding that architecture could be weaponized, that a well-designed entrance sequence could intimidate as effectively as words, that material choices could project permanence and power, that the physical spaces where society gathered determined who controlled society itself. Richard Morris Hunt died in 1895, just before the mansion's completion. He never saw Caroline preside over her first ball in the new space. But his design would serve her purposes perfectly for the next 12 years, until her death in 1908. Hunt had built more than a mansion. He'd built a machine designed for one purpose: maintaining Caroline Astor's absolute control over American society. The double mansion strategy. The mansion that rose at 840 to 842 Fifth Avenue wasn't one house. It was two. And that distinction was everything. From the street, visitors saw a unified French chateau, symmetrical, elegant, impossibly grand. 4 stories of Indiana limestone rising from the corner of 5th Avenue and 65th Street, facing Central Park with aristocratic confidence. The facade suggested one massive palace belonging to one powerful family. But behind that unified exterior lay careful separation. The building's design created 2 distinct residences divided by a central partition wall, each with its own entrance, its own service areas, its own private spaces. Caroline occupied the northern half at 840 Fifth Avenue. Her son John Jacob Astor IV occupied the southern portion at 842 Fifth Avenue. This wasn't about saving money by building together. Both had fortunes sufficient to build separate palaces. This was strategy. And Caroline's strategic genius was operating on multiple levels simultaneously. First, the appearance of unity. A divided mansion still looked like one palace from outside. The message to society was clear. The Astors were a dynasty, not individuals. When you dealt with Caroline, you were dealing with the family's full power. When you offended Caroline, you offended John Jacob IV and his considerable business influence. The architecture announced that challenging Mrs. Astor meant challenging an entire clan. Second, actual independence. Behind the unified facade, Caroline maintained complete control over her domain, her entrance, her servants, her decisions about decoration, entertaining, daily life. She wasn't living in her son's house or sharing control with a younger generation. The partition wall gave her autonomy while projecting familial solidarity. Third, the shared ballroom. This was the brilliance that made the entire strategy work. The ballroom occupied the rear of the building, spanning the width of both residences. Both Caroline and John Jacob IV could access it from their respective sides, but Caroline controlled it. The ballroom was hers, her space, her rules, her guest lists. John Jacob IV could use it when she allowed, but everyone understood whose territory this was. And what a ballroom it was! Hunt had designed a space that could accommodate 1,200 guests, 3 times the capacity of Caroline's old brownstone. The room stretched 60 feet wide and 80 feet long with a ceiling height of 25 feet. Enormous by any standard, but Hunt's proportions prevented it from feeling cavernous. The height-to-width ratio created intimacy despite the scale. The floor was polished parquet oak laid in intricate patterns. Massive mirrors covered one wall, doubling the apparent size and reflecting candlelight, later electric light, to create the illusion of endless space filled with endless people. French doors along the park-facing wall could open in warm weather, extending the ballroom onto a terrace. But the ballroom's real genius was its capacity calculation. 1,200 wasn't arbitrary. It was strategic. Caroline's old ballroom held 400, and the 400 had become shorthand for American society's absolute peak. Those 400 families represented everyone who mattered, packed into one room during her annual January ball. It was exclusive precisely because it was constrained. The new ballroom's capacity of 1,200 changed the mathematics entirely. Now Caroline could maintain the 400 as her inner circle while accommodating another 800 guests in concentric rings of decreasing intimacy. The ballroom's geography became a physical manifestation of social hierarchy. The innermost area, closest to where Caroline received guests, remained the exclusive zone, the 400's traditional territory. But now a second tier could be included. Important, but not essential families. Business magnates whose fortunes were too new for full acceptance but too large to ignore. Foreign nobility visiting America. Politicians whose influence was useful even if their pedigree was lacking. And the outer edges of the ballroom, farthest from Caroline, could accommodate a third tier. Aspirants, strivers, families desperate to be seen at Mrs. Astor's ball even if they never spoke to her directly. Their presence at the periphery served multiple purposes. They filled the space, they demonstrated Caroline's expansive power, and they provided the 400 with people to look down upon, reinforcing the inner circle's superiority. The ballroom's design facilitated this hierarchy. Hunt had created subtle variations in ceiling height and detail that made some areas feel more prestigious than others. The section nearest Caroline featured the most elaborate plasterwork, the finest materials. As you moved away from the center, decorative details simplified slightly. Not enough for casual observers to notice, but enough that those attuned to such gradations understood their position. The shared entrance hall connecting the two residences was equally theatrical. Hunt designed a glass-domed space with marble walls and a fountain featuring bronze dolphins and infant Neptunes spouting water. Visitors entering for the first time would pass through bronze gates, cross the forecourt, enter the vestibule lined with Astor ancestor busts, then emerge into this spectacular hall where light filtered through the glass dome, reflecting off marble and water. The effect was overwhelming by design. Before guests even reached Caroline or the ballroom, they'd been subjected to a carefully choreographed sequence of spaces, each one more impressive than the last, each one reinforcing the message, "You are entering the domain of America's most powerful family. Behave accordingly." The dining rooms in each residence further demonstrated the double mansion's strategic brilliance. Caroline's dining room was pure theatrical intimidation. Black marble walls, black and white marble-tiled floors covered with polar bear rugs, a massive marble fireplace carved with hunting scenes, tapestries depicting medieval nobles at sport. The room announced that the Astors weren't new money pretending to be aristocracy. They were aristocracy, with the ancestral trappings to prove it. John Jacob IV's spaces were similarly grand but slightly less imposing. His residence functioned as the family's business headquarters, where he met with associates, conducted financial negotiations, hosted dinners related to his various enterprises. His dining room projected power, but prioritized functionality over pure intimidation. This division of purpose made the double mansion more effective than two separate houses would have been. Caroline's side specialized in social warfare, every space designed to intimidate, impress, and maintain her position as society's queen. John Jacob IV's side handled business and political influence. Together, the building projected total dominance across all spheres that mattered in Gilded Age America. The construction had cost a fortune. Estimates ranged from $1 to $2 million, equivalent to perhaps $50 million or more today. But Caroline viewed it as investment, not expense. Every dollar spent on intimidating marble and elaborate plasterwork was a dollar that reinforced her power, prevented challenges, maintained the system that kept her at the top. When the mansion was completed in 1896, the effect on New York society was immediate. Other wealthy families suddenly found their own homes wanting. The Vanderbilts' massive Fifth Avenue palazzo looked gaudy by comparison. The new money families building ornate mansions further up Fifth Avenue looked like they were trying too hard. Caroline's restraint, French Renaissance elegance rather than Italianate excess, made everyone else's architectural choices seem nouveau riche. More importantly, the double mansion announced that the Astor family dynasty was permanent. This wasn't a house that would be sold when one generation died. The structure physically accommodated family continuity, mother and son, today, but implying future generations would occupy these connected residences, perpetuating Astor power indefinitely. Of course, that permanence would prove illusory, but in 1896, standing in the shadow of Hunt's masterpiece, with Caroline presiding over ballroom spectacles that made European courts seem provincial, the Astor dynasty felt eternal. The double mansion had achieved exactly what Caroline intended: architectural dominance so complete that challenging her social authority would require challenging a building that looked like it had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more. The ballroom as social sorting machine. The ballroom at 840 Fifth Avenue wasn't just a room where parties happened. It was a precision instrument designed to sort, rank, and control American society with mechanical efficiency. Think of it as a machine. Input: 1,200 guests arriving with varying degrees of social status, wealth, and ambition. Output: a clear hierarchy visible to everyone present, with each person's exact position in society, demonstrated by their physical location, relative to Mrs. Astor. The sorting began before anyone entered the ballroom. Invitations went out in January for the annual ball, typically held in late January or early February. Receiving an invitation meant you existed. Not receiving one meant you didn't, at least not in any way that mattered to the people who controlled business, politics, and culture in Gilded Age America. But the invitation was just entry to the machine. What happened inside the ballroom determined your actual status. Caroline received guests while standing in a specific location, typically near the center of the ballroom, backed by Hunt's most elaborate architectural details. She wore a diamond tiara that caught the light, ensuring she was visually identifiable even in a crowd of 1,200. This wasn't vanity, it was strategic visibility. Everyone needed to know exactly where she stood so they could orient themselves accordingly. The closest circle, perhaps 20 feet radius around Caroline, was reserved for the 400's absolute core. Old money families with impeccable lineage, her closest social allies. People she genuinely liked, which was rare. This inner circle could approach Caroline directly, speak with her, be seen in her immediate presence. That visibility mattered enormously. Business deals were negotiated based on who was seen talking to Mrs. Astor. Marriages were arranged between families who stood together in her circle. The second ring, extending perhaps to 50 feet, included the rest of the 400. Important families, necessary allies, people whose absence would be noticed. They could approach Caroline if she signaled permission. A glance, a slight nod. But they didn't presume. They waited. Their position in this zone announced, We belong, but we know our place. The third ring, occupying the ballroom's middle distance, held the new money families, foreign visitors, politicians, and others whose inclusion served Caroline's purposes, but who weren't truly accepted. They could see her, could watch the inner circles, but they couldn't approach without invitation. Their presence filled the space, made the ball impressive through sheer numbers. But they were atmosphere, not substance. The outer edges, the areas farthest from Caroline, near the walls and in corners, were for the aspirants, families who'd received invitations but whose status was marginal. They were present, technically, but their distance from the center announced their irrelevance. Some stayed in these outer zones all night, never approaching Caroline, attending the ball just to say they'd attended. This geographical hierarchy was reinforced by Caroline's movement through the room. When she decided to circulate, which she did strategically, not randomly, she moved from the center outward in concentric rings, speaking briefly with people in each zone before returning to the center. The order of her circulation demonstrated rank. First circle, extended conversations. Second circle, polite exchanges. Third circle, brief acknowledgments. Outer edges. Sometimes nothing more than a distant nod. Ward McAllister, her social secretary, managed the circulation like a military operation. He knew who needed to be acknowledged, who could be ignored, who required just enough attention to keep them loyal, but not enough to suggest they'd risen in status. McAllister would position himself near Caroline, quietly indicating who should approach, who should wait, who should give up and return to the periphery. The ballroom's design supported this system. Hunt had created subtle variations in lighting and decoration that made different zones feel distinct. The center, where Caroline stood, featured the most elaborate ceiling details and the best lighting, during the gaslight era from carefully placed fixtures, later from electric chandeliers positioned to illuminate the inner circle, while leaving the outer edges slightly dimmer. The mirrors along one wall served multiple purposes. They made the space seem larger, yes, but they also allowed people throughout the ballroom to watch Caroline's position and movement without obviously staring. You could stand facing away from the center, apparently engaged in conversation, while actually monitoring the mirrors to see who approached Mrs. Astor, how long they spoke, whether they were welcomed or dismissed. The acoustic design was equally clever. The ballroom's proportions allowed conversation in the inner circles to remain private despite the crowd. You could stand 20 feet from Caroline and hear nothing of what she discussed. But if you were in her immediate circle, you could speak quietly and be heard. This acoustic intimacy reinforced the exclusivity. Being close enough to hear Caroline's conversations meant you mattered. The annual ball's timing, late January, was strategic. It came near the end of New York's winter social season, after families had spent months positioning themselves for inclusion. The ball served as the season's verdict. If you'd made it onto the guest list, your year's social efforts had succeeded. If not, you'd failed. The ball's position in the calendar meant families had 11 months to work toward next year's invitation, keeping them focused on pleasing Mrs. Astor year-round. The guest list's creation was theatrical in itself. McAllister would meet with Caroline regularly throughout the previous year, discussing families who'd risen or fallen in her estimation. A business scandal, a divorce, marrying beneath one's station, offending the wrong people at smaller social events, any of these could result in removal from the list. Conversely, a particularly successful business venture, a strategic marriage, demonstrating proper deference at other society events. These could earn an invitation for families previously excluded. The list was never published officially, but everyone knew who'd attended. Newspapers would report the next day, listing prominent guests and describing the event in exhaustive detail. Families who'd attended would mention it casually in conversation for months afterward. Those who hadn't attended would make excuses. They'd been traveling. Someone had been ill. They'd chosen to attend something else that night. Nobody admitted exclusion, but everybody knew. The ballroom also functioned as a marriage market. Wealthy families brought their daughters, hoping to secure advantageous matches with suitable young men from other elite families. Being seen at Mrs. Astor's ball improved a young woman's matrimonial prospects significantly. Not attending suggested problems with her family's status or her personal reputation. Marriages arranged based on connections made at these balls joined fortunes, consolidated business interests, and reinforced the social hierarchy across generations. For men, the ballroom was about business networks as much as social status. Standing in the inner circles meant access to other wealthy men making decisions about investments, partnerships, industrial ventures. A conversation at Mrs. Astor's ball could lead to business opportunities worth millions. Being excluded meant missing those conversations, those opportunities, those networks. The system's genius was that it required constant maintenance. You couldn't attend one ball and assume permanent inclusion. Status had to be reinforced annually through proper behavior, strategic social positioning, and, most importantly, continued deference to Mrs. Astor's authority. The ballroom's geography might change slightly year to year as families rose or fell in Caroline's estimation, but the basic structure remained. Concentric circles radiating from the center, where Mrs. Astor stood in her diamond tiara, sorting America's elite with architectural precision. Beechcliff, the summer headquarters. While Manhattan provided winter theater, Caroline understood that true aristocratic authority required a coastal fortress. Beechcliff commanded 9 oceanfront acres at 580 Bellevue Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island, the summer capital of American high society. The mansion sprawled across 16,400 square feet, with 39 rooms of Italian magnificence gazing across the Atlantic toward the European courts that inspired its grandeur. Built originally in the 1850s as a marine villa, Caroline transformed it into her summer headquarters through Richard Morris Hunt's spectacular renovations between 1888 and 1890. Hunt's waterfront ballroom was pure theatrical excess. Oak parquet floors laid in wave-like patterns rippled beneath guests' feet. Seaweed-shaped brass sconces cast shimmering light across bas reliefs depicting Poseidon and Aphrodite. The ballroom incorporated 800 panes of glass, mirrored walls, and abundant French doors that transformed evening entertainments into underwater fantasies. This wasn't decorative whimsy. The oceanic theme reinforced a message. The Astors commanded not just Manhattan's social sphere, but nature itself. The ballroom could open completely to the ocean breeze, blurring the boundary between interior and exterior, suggesting that Caroline's domain extended beyond walls to encompass the very Atlantic coast. From 1881 to 1908, Beechcliff served as Newport's social epicenter during the 8-week summer season. Caroline presided over elaborate parties for her elite circle, with the highlight being her summer ball that determined social standing for the following year. Hunt's specially designed ballroom accommodated the full complement of the 400, ensuring that every member of America's social elite could gather under one magnificently decorated roof facing the sea. The summer season operated differently than winter in Manhattan. Newport was about leisure, yachting, tennis, beach activities, but leisure as competitive sport. Who had the finest yacht? Whose parties were most exclusive? Which families could afford to abandon business for 8 weeks of elaborate entertaining? Caroline's presence in Newport legitimized the entire summer colony. Families who couldn't secure invitations to Beechcliff events were effectively excluded from Newport society, regardless of their wealth. After Caroline's death in 1908, the property passed through various owners, eventually becoming a living history museum. In 2010, Oracle founder Larry Ellison purchased Beechcliff for $10.5 million and launched a comprehensive restoration exceeding $100 million. The project, overseen by architect John Grosvenor, aims to return Beechcliff to its 1881 appearance, creating the Beechcliff Art Museum to house Ellison's collection of 18th and 19th century European art. The restoration includes rebuilding the dramatic arched loggia, destroyed by Hurricane Carol in 1954, and restoring Hunt's original features lost to time and weather. That a tech billionaire would invest over $100 million restoring Caroline Astor's summer palace proves that Gilded Age glamour retains its power to captivate, even when the social system it supported has long since collapsed. Ferncliff, the feudal kingdom. Beyond the glittering ballrooms lay Ferncliff, 2,800 acres in the Hudson River Valley that revealed the Astor's most ambitious vision. Creating American aristocracy required not just social dominance but actual feudal landholding. The estate sprawled across Rhinebeck's rolling hills like a self-contained principality. A substantial mansion built in 1874, dairy and poultry operations, horse breeding stables, multiple staff quarters, a private railroad siding. This wasn't a retreat. It was territorial control on European scale. Here's what's remarkable. Caroline rarely visited. She preferred European spas to pastoral American landscapes. Ferncliff was William's passion, and later John Jacob Astor IV's domain. But Caroline understood its strategic value even without personal attachment. Gilded Age aristocracy required demonstrating that your wealth came from land, not just industry. Old European nobility owned estates. Therefore, American families aspiring to aristocratic status needed estates too. The original mansion was greatly expanded when John Jacob IV inherited the property in 1892. In 1902, he commissioned Stanford White to design a remarkable sports pavilion, 40,000 square feet, including one of America's first indoor swimming pools, tennis court, squash court, and bowling alley. The building, inspired by Versailles' Grand Trianon, featured arched windows and marble columns, bringing French classical architecture to the Hudson Valley with characteristic Astor audacity. The estate included a gatehouse designed by Louis Ayres in 1879, various staff quarters, dairy barns, a tea house, and a greenhouse imported from England. Impressive iron gates from 1895 marked the main entrance like medieval fortifications protecting modern nobility. What Ferncliff represented was legitimacy through land. The Astors could be dismissed as mere merchants, fur traders, real estate speculators, commercial operators. But a 2,800-acre working estate with agricultural operations and architectural splendor, that suggested permanence, rootedness, the kind of dynastic continuity that European aristocracy had and American new money desperately wanted. Caroline never needed to visit for Ferncliff to serve her purposes. Its existence in the family portfolio announced, "We're not just rich. We own the land itself. We're not temporary. We're established." After John Jacob IV's death on the Titanic in 1912, the estate passed to his son William Vincent Astor, who eventually demolished the original mansion in the 1940s and converted Stanford White's sports pavilion into his primary residence, Astor Courts. Following Vincent's death in 1959, Brooke Astor broke up the massive estate, donating 200 acres to establish Ferncliff Forest Nature Preserve in 1964, with other portions becoming private homes and a nursing facility. Eric and Wendy Schmidt purchased Astor Courts in 2016, undertaking extensive restoration with PBDW architects, and Samuel White, Stanford White's great-grandson. The estate's fragmentation after 1959 reflected changing American attitudes toward landed wealth, but its century of Astor ownership had accomplished its purpose, proving the family's aristocratic credentials through territorial control. The architecture of intimidation. Caroline Astor's genius wasn't just building grand houses, it was understanding how physical spaces could psychologically manipulate everyone who entered them. Every detail of her mansions was calculated to create specific emotional responses. Let's examine the techniques she and her architects employed to maintain control through environmental psychology. In each residence, Caroline received guests while standing before her life-size portrait by Carolus Duran. This wasn't vanity, it was multiplication of presence. Guests faced two Caroline Astors, the painted version in elaborate gown and jewels, and the living version similarly adorned. The portrait suggested permanence. She'd been painted, memorialized, made eternal, while the living woman demonstrated current power. The doubling was deeply unsettling on a subconscious level. Hunt designed the Fifth Avenue mansion so guests experienced escalating luxury. The entrance vestibule was impressive, marble, busts of ancestors. But the Great Hall beyond was more impressive. Soaring 3 stories, elaborate plasterwork. The drawing rooms were even more ornate. Finally, the ballroom represented peak magnificence. This progression ensured that by the time guests reached Caroline, they'd been subjected to continuous architectural intimidation, arriving already psychologically diminished. Caroline's preference for marble, especially black marble in the dining room, wasn't about aesthetics alone. Marble is heavy, cold, permanent. It suggests buildings that will outlast everyone present. The black marble dining room with its polar bear rugs created an atmosphere of ancestral hunting lodges, implying the Astors had been wealthy for centuries, generations. They hadn't, and would remain wealthy for generations more. The ballroom's acoustic properties allowed Caroline to conduct quiet conversations that couldn't be overheard even in crowded rooms. This created the impression that she possessed secret knowledge, that important discussions happened in her presence that others weren't privy to. The acoustic design gave her informational advantage. She could hear what others said across the room, while her own conversations remained private. Caroline's diamond tiara wasn't fashion, it was a beacon. In a ballroom of 1,200 people, guests needed to know exactly where she stood. The tiara caught light from any angle, making her position constantly visible. This allowed her to control the room's geography without moving. People oriented themselves relative to her location, and she could observe who approached, who kept distance, who tried to position themselves advantageously. Caroline renovated constantly, not because the houses needed it, but to prevent anyone from matching her. By the time a rival family built something comparable to her current decor, she'd already moved to the next trend. The French Regency dining room at 355th Avenue was transformed into glittering Louis XVI style. The drawing room underwent multiple renovations. This constant change kept everyone else perpetually behind, unable to achieve the same level of current sophistication. Caroline maintained staffs of 50-plus servants at each major residence. These weren't just for convenience, they were demonstrations of power. The seamless perfection of her entertaining came from enormous hidden labor. Guests who couldn't afford similar staffing would attempt to recreate her events and fail, revealing their comparative poverty. The invisible army made Caroline's hospitality seem effortless, which made others' visible efforts seem inadequate. Her residences carefully segregated spaces where guests were received from spaces where family lived. Guests never saw private quarters, never witnessed the messiness of actual daily life. They experienced only the theatrical version of Astor existence, perfectly staged, perfectly executed. This separation allowed Caroline to maintain mystique. No one knew how she actually lived, which meant they couldn't know if their own private lives were comparable or inferior. Caroline kept her public rooms slightly cool, not uncomfortable, but just enough to prevent guests from fully relaxing. Relaxed people become familiar, presumptuous. Slightly cool people remain alert, formal, conscious of their environment. Meanwhile, Caroline, accustomed to her houses and dressed appropriately, remained comfortable while her guests experienced subtle physical discomfort that translated to psychological unease. Each residence had distinctive scents. Fresh flowers changed daily, specific perfumes, particular woods burning in fireplaces. These olfactory signatures created memory associations. Years after attending an event at Mrs. Astor's, catching a similar scent would trigger memories of the experience, the anxiety of being judged, the relief of inclusion. Scent is the sense most powerfully connected to memory, and Caroline's houses were engineered to be unforgettable. Caroline allowed selective photography and press coverage of her events, but always controlled what was documented. The threat of being photographed, or deliberately not photographed, kept guests performing proper behavior. Everyone knew the newspapers would report who'd attended, what they'd worn, how they'd been received. This public documentation meant that social failures at Caroline's events became part of permanent record, while social successes could be referenced for years. These techniques worked because they operated below conscious awareness. Guests didn't think, I'm being psychologically manipulated by acoustic design and material choices. They simply felt the effect. Awe, anxiety, gratitude for inclusion, determination to maintain access. The architecture did Caroline's work for her, maintaining control while she appeared to simply be a gracious hostess in beautiful homes. When the empire crumbled. October 30th, 1908. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor died at 840 Fifth Avenue, age 78. The woman who'd ruled American society for half a century was gone, and her empire began collapsing immediately. The funeral was appropriately grand. Services at Grace Church, burial at Trinity Cemetery. Obituaries in every major newspaper documenting her reign as America's social queen. But beneath the respectful coverage, a question circulated through society. What happens now? John Jacob Astor IV inherited his mother's mansion. He owned the building, the furnishings, the physical spaces where Caroline had wielded power. What he didn't inherit was her authority. That died with her. John Jacob IV tried. He hosted parties at 840 Fifth Avenue, attempting to continue his mother's traditions. But something fundamental was missing. The guests came. How could they refuse an Astor invitation? But the gatherings felt hollow. Without Caroline standing before her portrait, receiving guests with that particular combination of graciousness and intimidation, the mansion was just an expensive venue. The ballroom that had sorted American society with mechanical precision became just a room. Large, certainly. Beautiful, absolutely. But no longer imbued with the power to determine social standing through geographical proximity to the hostess. John Jacob IV lacked his mother's gift for making architectural space perform social work. Part of the problem was gender. Gilded Age society granted women authority over social matters that men simply didn't possess. A man hosting parties was doing business networking or entertaining for political purposes. A woman hosting parties was performing the serious work of society maintenance. John Jacob IV could never occupy his mother's role because that role was inherently feminine in late 19th, early 20th century America. But the larger problem was that the system Caroline had built required her specific personality, her strategic intelligence, her ruthlessness disguised as graciousness, her decades of accumulated social knowledge about which families had risen or fallen and why. This wasn't transferable authority, it was personal power that happened to operate through architectural spaces. By 1910, New York society was fragmenting. Without Caroline's centralizing authority, multiple competing social leaders emerged. The Vanderbilts had always been powerful, but now they weren't competing with Mrs. Astor. They were competing with each other and various other wealthy families for social supremacy. The clear hierarchy that Caroline had maintained dissolved into confusion. Then, April 15th, 1912, the Titanic sank, taking John Jacob Astor IV with it. He'd been traveling with his second wife, Madeline, a woman 30 years his junior, controversial precisely because the age gap violated social propriety. John Jacob IV had forced society to accept the marriage through sheer wealth and Astor name recognition. But he'd spent social capital doing so, capital his mother would never have wasted on personal desires. When he died at sea, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. The Titanic represented Gilded Age excess at its peak, the largest, most luxurious ship ever built, supposedly unsinkable, destroyed on its maiden voyage by an iceberg. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest men in America, inheritor of his mother's social empire, unable to save himself despite unlimited money. The metaphor was perfect. Wealth couldn't protect against fate. Power had limits. The Gilded Age's assumptions that money solved everything, that the established order would persist indefinitely, that certain families would always rule, were proven false in the North Atlantic's freezing water. After John Jacob IV's death, 845th Avenue lost whatever remaining social significance it possessed. His widow Madeline had no interest in continuing society traditions. His son Vincent inherited the property, but lived primarily at other Astor residences. The double mansion, designed to house generations of family dynasty, housed no one in particular. The neighborhood was changing anyway. Fifth Avenue above 59th Street was becoming increasingly commercial. The residential palaces of the 1890s were impractical, expensive to maintain, surrounded by businesses and hotels that destroyed the exclusive atmosphere. One by one, Gilded Age families were abandoning their mansions or converting them to other uses. In 1925, Vincent Astor sold 840 to 842 Fifth Avenue to a real estate developer. The double mansion, Caroline's Palace, Hunt's masterpiece, the building designed to project Astor permanence for centuries, was demolished in 1926, 20 years after Caroline's death, 18 years after its completion. The site became Temple Emmanuel, a Reform Jewish synagogue. The symbolism was striking. The building designed to house Christian American aristocracy replaced by a temple serving Jewish immigrants and their descendants. Exactly the kind of new Americans that Caroline's 400 had been designed to exclude. Today, standing on Fifth Avenue and 65th Street, you can look at Temple Emmanuel and imagine the ballroom that once occupied approximately the same space. Imagine Caroline standing in her diamond tiara, sorting American society with architectural precision. Imagine the anxious guests calculating their distance from her, hoping for acknowledgement, fearing dismissal. But it's difficult to imagine, because that world is so thoroughly gone that even its physical spaces have been erased. Beechcliff survived, barely. After decades of changing ownership and near demolition, Larry Ellison's restoration in 2010 saved the structure. But it survives as a museum, not as the summer headquarters of American society. The ballroom with its ocean theme now hosts art exhibitions rather than the 400. Ferncliff was broken up. 2,800 acres divided among various purposes, the original mansion demolished. Only Stanford White's sports pavilion survived as Astor Courts, now owned by tech billionaires rather than industrial age aristocrats. The physical spaces where Caroline Astor ruled American society for 50 years were either destroyed or repurposed within decades of her death. The Empire State Building rose where her brownstone stood. A synagogue replaced her greatest palace. Her summer estate became a museum. Her feudal kingdom fragmented into nature preserves and nursing homes. Everything she built, architecturally, socially, dynastically, proved temporary. Not because the buildings were poorly constructed. Hunt designed them to last centuries. But because the social system they supported couldn't outlast the woman who'd created it. Caroline's death revealed the truth. Her power hadn't been architectural. The mansions were just tools. Her power was personal. Intelligence, strategy, ruthlessness, decades of accumulated knowledge about society's mechanics. When she died, that knowledge died. The buildings remained briefly, emptied of meaning, until economics and changing times erased them too. The legacy: how one woman invented American society. Caroline Astor died in 1908. Her mansions were demolished by 1931. The social system she created collapsed within years of her death. Yet we're still talking about her, still fascinated by the 400, still studying her strategies. Why? Because Caroline Astor invented something that persists even after its physical manifestations vanished. She created the template for American social hierarchy in a nation that officially rejected hierarchy. America was founded on the rejection of inherited titles and aristocratic privilege. No nobility, no hereditary power, everyone theoretically equal under law. But Caroline understood that humans crave hierarchy, that societies naturally stratify, that people desperately want to know who's above them and who's below them. She gave Americans aristocracy without calling it aristocracy. She created exclusivity without inherited titles. She built a system where you could rise through proper behavior and advantageous marriage, theoretically, but where in practice she controlled access absolutely. The genius was making it seem natural. Of course, only 400 people could fit in the ballroom. That was architectural constraint, not arbitrary exclusion. Of course, you needed 3 generations of respectable lineage. That was tradition, not discrimination. Of course, certain families belonged and others didn't. That was simply the way things were. Caroline took the messy, chaotic social reality of Gilded Age New York, new fortunes appearing weekly, old families losing wealth, immigrants arriving, traditional hierarchies collapsing, and imposed order through sheer force of will backed by strategic architecture. She made chaos legible. And once it was legible, she could control it. The 400 became shorthand for American social exclusivity that persists 140 years later. We still refer to the 400 when discussing elite groups. The number itself, arbitrary, based on one ballroom's capacity, became permanently embedded in how Americans think about social hierarchy. Her model influenced everything that came after. Country clubs with limited membership, that's Caroline's scarcity principle in action. Charity galas with tiered ticket prices placing people in different rooms or sections, that's her concentric circle geography replicated. The Met Gala, where who you sit with indicates your exact position in fashion/entertainment hierarchy, that's pure Mrs. Astor methodology applied to modern celebrity culture. Harvard's final clubs, Manhattan co-op boards that reject billionaires for insufficient social standing. Private school admission processes that consider family legacy more than academic merit. All of these are descendants of Caroline's system, gatekeepers determining access, scarcity creating value, social geography indicating rank. But her deeper legacy is demonstrating that in America, money alone isn't power. Money plus real estate plus social theater equals control. Caroline understood something most Gilded Age millionaires didn't. You can't buy your way into the established elite. You have to build parallel systems that make the established elite irrelevant, or force them to acknowledge your alternative power base. That's why she built mansions instead of just attending other people's parties. Why she created her own social spaces instead of trying to infiltrate existing ones. She didn't ask for acceptance. She made herself the gatekeeper whose acceptance others sought. The modern parallels are striking. Tech billionaires building private compounds and hosting exclusive conferences at their estates. They're following Caroline's playbook. Celebrities who create their own award shows and charity events instead of attending traditional ones, same strategy. Anyone who builds private spaces and then controls access to them is using techniques Caroline perfected 130 years ago. What happened to her properties proves that even the grandest architectural statements are temporary. The Empire State Building stands where her brownstone stood, and probably fewer than 1 in 10,000 people who visit the Empire State Building knows an Astor mansion was there first. Temple Emmanuel replaced her greatest palace, and congregants praying there likely don't imagine Caroline sorting society in approximately the same physical space generations earlier. This impermanence might seem like failure. Caroline built an empire, and it crumbled within decades. But perhaps that's not the right way to measure her success. Because what she actually created, the concepts, the strategies, the understanding of how social power works, those survived even when the buildings didn't. Every time someone uses architecture to project power, they're following Caroline's lead. Every time scarcity is deliberately created to increase value, that's her technique. Every time someone builds their own space rather than trying to enter existing spaces, that's her strategy. She proved that in America, where official aristocracy is forbidden, you can create unofficial aristocracy through social theater performed in carefully designed architectural spaces. You can sort people into hierarchies they'll accept as natural because they're based on physical geography rather than explicit rules. You can control who matters by controlling who gets invited to the spaces where people who matter gather, the mansions are gone, the social system collapsed, the Astor dynasty fragmented, but the model remains. Because Caroline Astor understood something fundamental about human nature, we need to know where we stand. Give people a clear hierarchy, and they'll generally accept their place in it, especially if you make that hierarchy visible through physical space, through who stands where, through architectural intimidation dressed as hospitality. She weaponized real estate, and that weapon remains available to anyone who understands how she wielded it. That's her legacy. Not the demolished mansions, but the knowledge that architecture plus strategy equals power. That geography determines hierarchy. that controlling physical space means controlling the people who occupy it. 1 woman. 4 primary mansions. 50 years of absolute social control. The buildings are gone, but what she proved, that you can dominate American society through architectural strategy, that knowledge survives. That's why we're still studying her. That's why her story matters. Because anyone who wants to understand power, how it's built, how it's maintained, how it eventually crumbles, can learn from Caroline Astor. The woman who ruled the Gilded Age from ballrooms, carefully designed to sort America's elite with mechanical precision. The woman who understood that in America, whoever controls the party controls everything.